Good evening, everyone. On behalf of AgriSearch and our partners in AFBI and Queen's University and our team of very enthusiastic farmers, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar, Multi-Species Swords, a View from the Farm. Before we start, just a few items of housekeeping. You are automatically muted, so you don't need to worry about that. Please use the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, to ask questions. Questions are open, and if you see a question already asked that you would like to see answered, you can upvote on that by clicking the thumbs up icon. If you have any issues, leaving and rejoining will usually fix them. The webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards on the AgriSearch YouTube channel. And again, we would ask you to please complete the feedback survey at the end of the webinar, as this is really useful to us in planning future events. Next slide. I don't need to tell any of you about the many challenges facing farmers at the moment. Our input costs, most notably fertilizer, are increasing rapidly. Climate change legislation with ambitious targets will soon be hitting the Northern Ireland statute books. In addition, farmers are also under increasing pressure to improve water quality and biodiversity. The forthcoming ammonia mitigation proposals are also likely to encourage increased adoption of extended grazing practices. Next slide. The changing climate is also having an effect on farming. In a few weeks' time, we'll be starting up the Grass Check Bulletin for another season. As always, this will feature a 10-year average line on the graph. The 10-year average graph for 2012 to 2021 totals 11.8 tonnes, which is down 0.8 tonnes up from the previous figure of 12.6 tonnes of dry matter per hectare for the 2011-2020 average, as a recent spate of drier years with restricted summer growth starts to bite. Next slide, please. The east of this is bearing the brunt of this, with the growth on our grass check farms in County Down around 25% lower than those in Fermanagh. Research in other parts of the world, including the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, has indicated that multi-species swords have the potential to answer many of these challenges and provide a source of feed which requires less manufacture of fertilizer, improves soil health, including improved carbon sequestration, along with enhanced animal performance, biodiversity, and drought resilience. Next slide, please. It was with this in mind that AgriSearch, with the support of our partners, applied and were successful at getting funding under the European Innovation Partnership Project to look at the potential role of multi-species swords within Northern Ireland beef and sheep farms. This EIP project is jointly funded by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. The project commenced in November 2020 and will conclude in June this year. Next slide, please. The EIP project group is comprised of 3 beef farmers and 3 sheep farmers, with technical input from AFBI and Queen's University, and is led by AgriSearch. During this evening's webinar, we will be sharing the experience and findings of our project to date. The EIP project has built on earlier work of the EU Super G project, which AFBI and AgriSearch are partners in. Next slide, please. Super G is a 5-year project that brings farmers and policymakers from across Europe together to co-develop sustainable permanent grassland systems and policies. The project involves 21 partners from 14 countries. One aim of the project was to recruit commercial and experimental farms to test different innovations that have the potential to improve permanent grassland management and the delivery of ecosystem services. Within Super G, AgriSearch is responsible for coordinating on-farm and field research experiments across Europe. Indeed, only a few weeks ago, we were getting an update from a research project in the Carpathian Mountains, not far from the borders of Ukraine. And of course, our thoughts are with everyone affected by current events in that part of the world, including our fellow farmers who urgently need to sow their crops in the breadbasket of Europe. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. David Patterson, who is grassland agronomist at AFBI Hillsborough, and will be talking about research at Hillsborough, Loughgall, as well as some desktop research he's been undertaking. David.
Okay, thank you, Jason, and good evening, everyone. Tonight I want to cover some of the research findings in multi-species swords. Thanks, Julian. The research to date, we're at a relatively young stage with our multi-species research work in AFBI, and it is comprised to date anyway, literature reviews, some grazing and plot studies, and of course the On Farms project that you've just heard about and we'll hear a lot more about as the evening goes on. Thank you. And in terms of, I've just picked out a few of the findings from the couple of literature reviews that we're involved with writing recently, and rooting is one of the key sort of features of multi-species swards that keeps coming up back and again in the literature, and it's looking at the root dynamics, the inference of rooting on other behaviors of the swards, and the actual physical aspects of the roots themselves. And an example of a relatively local project is the Soil to Carbon project, where they're looking at the impact of multi-species swards on soil health in particular, but looking across a range of findings from different research studies. The preliminary findings, as I've listed there, multi-species swards with the extra rooting capacity have the potential to break up compacted soils, to place carbon potentially deeper down into the soil root zone, to improve the level of soil organic matter, and improve the drought tolerance, which is great for the advocating of more resilience in our grassland. Next slide, please. And just an illustration here of a demonstration that was set up at the recent dairy fair back in December. You can see the species we're actually talking about. On the far left-hand side, there is a mature and a juvenile chicory plant, and you can see straight away the depth and the strength of the rooting capacity below those plants. In the middle are two grasses, ryegrass on the left and cocksfoot on the right. You can see more volume of rooting, at least, under the cocksfoot plant. And then on the far right hand side, a juvenile and a mature plantain plant. And there you can see, I hope, the not so much of a taproot as such, but more in the way of rooting volume is what we're seeing under the plantain swards. So that just sets the scene and lets you see some of the species we're talking about and the above and the below ground characteristics. Next slide, please. And again, on the rooting theme, coming through from the literature is the impact of the enhanced mineral uptake under these in these swards, and the knock-on effect for animal health potentially. And just a couple of findings there from the research showing that herb species were highest in iodine and selenium, which are very important. The grasses were highest in manganese, and legumes highest in copper and cobalt, and so on. And another piece of research showed that chicory had higher levels of calcium and copper, and the plantain had higher levels of copper and iodine than perennial ryegrass by comparison. Thank you. So overall, quick conclusions from the couple of literature reviews that we've done: the benefits of these multi-species swards, they have potential to use less artificial nitrogen fertilizer along with lower emissions, more resilient to drought, which is very important in recent years, improved soil structure, improved performance in lambs at any rate, potential of improved mineral uptake, and lower requirement for anthelmintics. The one comment I would say about the literature to date is that it has been, the majority of the findings are coming from Australian and New Zealand, Southern Hemisphere countries, and a lot of the research needs to be reproofed, if you like, and there is a building body of evidence across the UK and Southern Ireland, and ourselves and AFB are contributing to that. The challenges of these swards at the bottom of the slide there, they require a whole different type of sward management in comparison with a grass plus nitrogen type scenario. And the one finding that keeps coming up again and again is another challenge is the lack of persistency of some of the herb species. And in particular, I'm thinking of chicory there for one, and you'll hear some of the farmers' comments on that later on from their experience. Okay, thank you. So just getting into some of the local AFB trial results, you can see on the left-hand side a plot study where we were simulating the effect of grazing. So we took about 10 cuts off those plots over the last couple of years. And in those plots, we have individual varieties of individual species. So you'll have a pure chicory plot, a pure Timothy plot, and then we have some mixtures as well, where we've combined herbs, grasses, and legumes. And on the right-hand side is our grazing study at AFB Hillsborough, where we have a dedicated group, we had a dedicated group of cattle exclusively either grazing a grass clover plot or a multi-species paddock. Okay, thank you. Just some early results. The 2020 1 results there for dry matter yield. And in the literature, we were reading a lot about the phenomenon called over-yielding, and we wanted to try and see if that would manifest itself locally, and it did in this instance. What we have here on the far left-hand side of the graph is a mixture called, we've nicknamed it no grass, because it is made up of varieties of red clover, white clover, plantain and chicory, and they are all presented individually on the right-hand side of the graph. And what we found there was that with only, I think, 80 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare applied entirely across the growing season, the no grass mixture, which is just herbs and clover basically, out-yielded all of the individual component varieties when they were grown as separate monoculture plots. So the phenomenon of over-yielding was there, and you get that additive effect whenever you bring different groups of species together into the one sward in the one mixture. Next slide. And in the grazing study, we'll just skip on to the next slide, please, Gillian. What we didn't find was any improvement overall in terms of live weight performance of the cattle grazing those 2 sward types. Don't forget that was the multi-species versus the grass clover. And you can see there the red lines are the 2021 results and the green lines are the 2020 results, and they're very, very close. Dashed lines are the grass clover and the solid lines are the multi-species. And you can see straight away there was very, very little differences showing in terms of livestock performance over the 2 years. And the one caveat I would add in there is that the grass clover sward that we were comparing with there was an exceptionally good sward. So it was maybe no surprise. And the next slide, please. What we did find on a significant basis was whenever we looked at the fecal egg counts in the dung samples of the 2 batches of cattle. And you can see there that in 2021, in May, in June, and again in August, there was significantly lower fecal egg counts in the dung samples of the cattle grazing the multi-species swards. And that's that anthelmintic effect reported in the literature and was actually showing up and manifesting itself here in the trial. On the right-hand side, another not significant result showed that there was only similar levels of copper and selenium showing up so far in terms of blood samples taken from the 2 respective batches of cattle. Next slide, please. Returning to worms of a different sort, when we looked underneath the surface, there was a terrific student, Chris Boughton, a PhD student from Queen's, and he spent quite a bit of time digging, literally taking samples of earthworms underneath the surfaces of various sward types on different sites, including Afby Hillsborough. And you can see here on the left-hand side, this was the population of earthworms under a grass-only sward. And the right-hand photograph is the population underneath our multi-species sward. And not only did he find over a couple of seasons that there was significantly higher total population of worms underneath the multi-species sward, within that population, there was a higher proportion of the anisic worms, which are the ones that do the deep burrowing down into the soil root zone. And so they're much more beneficial in terms of opening up the soil structure and maintaining a really healthy, well aerated soil. Next slide, please. That just shows his graphs. The graph on the left, the green bar shows that there was a significantly higher total population, and the top right-hand side graph just shows there again, just underlines the fact that the anisic population were significantly higher under the multi-species swards, which is a terrific result to prove. Okay, thank you. So after all our literature studies and our preliminary conclusions from the grazing study and from the plot study down at Loughgall, just some of the preliminary conclusions here. Multi-species can produce higher yields than their component species and offer an opportunity to reduce chemical fertilizer use. which is very important at the moment. Multi-species can achieve similar animal performance relative to more conventional grass clover swards. The multi-species appear to reduce worm burdens in livestock and reduce the requirement for anthelmintic doses, which is a positive. And also, returning to the worms again, multi-species can promote greater populations of these deep burrowing earthworms, which has great impacts in terms of improvements to the soil's water infiltration and the soil aeration. And that will help both in terms of drought conditions and in waterlogging conditions. So next slide, please. So just to sum up, or just to finish off really, just a list here of the research work that we're involved in to date. The top half we've already discussed, and the bottom half are the new studies that are coming online, and some of which we're still seeking funding for. The first of the bottom set there is a sheep study, where we're not only looking at the lamb performance, which has already been reported on in the research. We are looking at the ewe performance, both in the summer grazing season and in the off season when they are on a silage diet. So we'll keep that through the lifetime of the sheep. There's a ryegrass plantain study with starting with dairy cows, and finally a livestock emission study, getting to grips with the emissions using zero grazed multi-species swards. I think, Jason, I will finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, David. And just to say, do keep putting your questions in the Q&A. I see quite a few building up there. And as if some already noted, you can like and upvote them as they go along. So the ones with the upvotes we'll obviously deal with first. So our next speaker is Sarah Bryan. Sarah is a project officer with AgriSearch who is working pretty much exclusively on the Super G project, and she's going to talk about the results of the on-farm EcoSward project. So Sarah, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So good evening, everyone. So as Jason mentioned, I'm going to present results from the EcoSward project. Next slide, please, Gillian. So the aim of this project is to examine the potential role of multi-species swards on commercial farms in Northern Ireland in enhancing production and delivery of ecosystem services. Next slide, please. So a bit of background on the farms involved. So there are a total of 7 farms involved. 2 of the farms are sheep farms. One of these farms is from County Antrim and the other is from County Down. There's 3 beef farms involved, and 2 of these farms are from County Down and the third is from County Tyrone. And finally, there's 2 dairy farms involved, and they are both from County Down. So all the beef and sheep farmers in this project are taking part in the multi-species sward Eip project, so you'll be hearing from them later on. There are a lot of farms from East Down involved in this project, which, as Jason mentioned earlier, it's partly due to the fact that this area in particular has been affected by the lack of rainfall in the last few summers. So there's been a lot of interest in multi-species swards in this area. The farms involved do have different soil types. Some will be more free draining and some will be heavier clay soils. And I should also say that the soil fertility across all the farms is relatively good. Next slide, please. So now looking at the seed mixes that the farmers used. So all the farmers sowed 2 different mixes. So one was a multi-species mix, which contained 80% perennial ryegrass, 11% white clover, and it also contained 2 different types of herbs. So it had 5% of plantain and 4% chicory. The second mix that the farmers sowed was just a grass clover mix. So it had 89% perennial ryegrass and 11% white clover in it. So one farm established in autumn 2019 and the rest established in spring or summer of 2020. So next slide, please. So now looking at some results. So for a few different reasons, we only have yield data for 4 of the farms. But looking at the table, so the blue column shows the yield results for the multi-species field on each farm, as well as the kilograms of nitrogen per hectare applied. And the green column shows the results for the grass clover swards on each farm. And then the third column shows the percentage difference in yield between the multi-species swards and the control swards. So farm A was the only farm where the control field out-yielded the multi-species field. So the multi-species yield was 9% lower than the control yield. However, the control field received 103 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, but the multi-species field only got 56 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So the control field got nearly double the amount of nitrogen compared to the multi-species field. So on farms B, C, and D, the multi-species and grass clover fields received the exact same amount of nitrogen. So the yields are directly comparable in these farms. So on farm B, the multi-species field had an 8% higher yield than the control field. Farm C has 2 fields involved in the project, and each field is split in half. So one field, or one half of the field, was sown with the multi-species mix, and the other half was sown with the grass clover mix. So in their first field, the multi-species side had a 7% higher yield, and in their second field, the multi-species side had an 11% higher yield than the control side. And so finally on farm D, they also put in 2 fields, and each field was also split in half the same way. So in their first field, the multi-species side had a 21% higher yield, and in their second field, the multi-species side had a 17% higher yield than the control side. So when we looked at all the results from the 4 farms together, we found that the multi-species yield was 7% higher than the grass clover yield, using 11% less nitrogen fertilizer. So it's still early days, but the results have been promising so far. Next slide, please. So now looking at some herbage quality results. So we took herbage samples in spring, summer, and autumn last year. Because of the different processes needed to analyze the herbage samples, we've only got the results for 8 grass clover and 9 herbal samples. So firstly, looking at the dry matter results, which are in the top left-hand corner. So the average dry matter of the multi-species samples was 18.8%, and the average dry matter of the control samples was 20.9%. So the dry matter of the multi-species samples was about 2% lower than the control samples. And this is due to the fact that the herbs are fleshier and would hold more water. So now looking at the table, so the blue column shows the average nutrient levels in the multi-species samples, and the green column is the results for the control samples. And then the third column shows the percentage difference between the nutrient levels in the multi-species and the control samples. So firstly, looking at the crude protein, and on average, the multi-species samples were 4.1% lower in crude protein than the control samples. Next, looking at the sequential fibers. So firstly, looking at NDF, and NDF can be used as an indicator of how much forage an animal is likely to consume. So as NDF increases, dry matter intakes decrease. So as you can see from the table, the multi-species samples on average were 5% lower in NDF than the control samples. So next, looking at ADF, and the ADF values relate to the animal's ability to digest the forage. So as the ADF value increases, the digestibility of forage can decrease. And the multi-species samples on average were 2.4% lower in ADF than the grass clover samples. And finally, looking at water-soluble carbohydrate, so the multi-species samples on average were 6.8% lower in water-soluble carbohydrate than the grass clover samples. So overall, the multi-species samples had slightly lower nutrient levels, however, the differences were quite small. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the mineral content of the samples. So the table on the left contains the actual figures, so the average amount of each mineral in the multi-species and the control samples. But I'm just going to go through the graph on the right, which shows the percentage difference in mineral levels between the multi-species and the control samples. So if the mineral has a blue bar above it, this means that the multi-species samples contained a higher amount of this mineral than the control samples. And if the mineral has a green bar below it, this means that the control samples contain more of this mineral than the multi-species samples. So as you can see, the multi-species samples are higher in 8 out of the 10 minerals that we tested for. So for example, the multi-species samples were 27.7% higher in calcium, 11.1% higher in copper, and 8% higher in magnesium. There was just 2 minerals which were lower in the multi-species samples. So the multi-species samples were 6.8% lower in manganese and 14.4% lower in sodium compared to the control samples. So overall, the multi-species samples were higher in the majority of the minerals we tested for. And next year, we're hoping to test for more minerals, potentially like iodine. Next slide, please. So we only have 1 year of data, so the results are very preliminary. But so far, this is what we have found. So multi-species swards can produce comparable or slightly higher yields to grass clover swards with lower fertilizer input. And compared to the grass clover swards, the multi-species swards had a slightly lower dry matter. They had slightly lower levels of crude protein, water-soluble carbohydrate, and sequential fibers. However, they were higher in the majority of the minerals that we tested for. So that's the end of my presentation. I would just like to thank all the farmers involved in the project for providing all this information and for all their help so far.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great. And now we move on to the first of our farmers tonight. And our first farmer is Paul, who farms in partnership with his son, Frank, near Downpatrick in County Down. And Paul, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Jason. First picture there is just a picture of one of the crops of multi-species that we grew. That was at its best in the middle of the summer. Slide, please, Gillian. Right, so basic background, we're a beef farm. We run suckler cows through the beef. We concentrate on grazing grass for as much time as possible. When they're not grazing, they're usually out wintered on brassicas. The whole farm is converted to a paddock grazing system now over the last few years, and most beef is finished off the grass. Soil types are a heavy medium classification. pH is 6.6 to 7.3 and have been corrected for P and K. The farm is considered to be quite stony and in places very close to the rock. So why did we pick the multi-species? Well, the main driver, of course, is always going to be economics. We needed to try to take control of our input costs. Now, to have our nitrogen would have been brilliant, except now it's double the price. So, we're doing a lot of work here. It's still only standing still. So we'll have to bear that in mind. So we've made a decision that we're going to have zero nitrogen fertilizers put on our multi-species. We're taking our cues from some of our organic friends. So we wanted a better understanding of whether or not we can improve the health of our animals and the live weight gains. There's also the potential for carbon sequestration and potential for methane production. So we'll keep an open mind on whatever research comes through in that there. We're also a very dry farm here in the summertime. And this is, we've got 2 or 3 very dry summers over the last 3 or 4 years. And it has major economic effect on the farm here. 2018, we had to sell stock. Now we can manage it a bit better than the initial shock of 2018, but it's very much in our minds. So we established a range of different multi-species mixes to compare what species or what suits best. Slide, Gillian, please. So this is a range of the different things we did. Some of it was part of the program, the old Swards. We had a field in which we've just heard about from the previous year. Quick note on that, it said the grass was established very well. The herbs didn't establish just as well. We think maybe we didn't have a high enough density of herbs whenever we first sowed it. But there was very little information out here. So we took a punt, we did a bit of reading around, and we basically took potluck. There's a couple of other issues crept in. The Brexit had a problem, and then was a shortage of getting herbs. So one of the mixes there is an 18 species mix. We brought it in from England, from Cotswolds. It's really a kitchen sink mix. We just threw everything in there, and we've grown it to see just how well it does, how many of the herbs persist, and that type of thing. Another one we did was a red clover, white clover, and plantain. Now that was a New Zealand idea. They have found that the persistency of chicory is very small, so we have to so we abandoned the chicory in that one, and we've just done it like that. We did a pure chicory sward, which was to do with the medicinal purposes or the anthelmintic properties. So it was put in as a pure stand to see, could we get any benefits from that. There's the standard DLF 6 species mix, which is an off-the-peg mix. We put it in. It has done very well. Then we wanted to put in a mix which is more drought resistant, and with the help of Dale, we put up this mix, which is, I think it's nearly the same as his, only we managed to buy bags of herbs and put it in with it as well. That was an issue, of course, with Brexit and all again. The Rolls Royce of the worming paddock is a San Juan product. We knew before we started that it would be very difficult to establish, and so it was. It's actually been probably the worst problem we've had. Slide, please, Gillian. So it was all done in April of last year. Conditions were excellent, a bit cold, but it was ground that was coming out of kale, which we had overwintered the cattle on. Dried up extremely well, and it was a full plough, para roll, seed and roll. Now, this is when it all started to get interesting, because there's no weed control once you commit to doing these herbs. So whenever it started to go green, we thought, oh, this is brilliant. But then if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see it was nothing but chickweed. So alarm bells started to rise to go off then. Slide, please, Ellen. Right, so we were very worried that all the team came around to see what we'd done, and it looked dreadful. It was full of weeds, it was full of chickweed, a bit of red shank, any other weed was probably there. And we didn't know what to do with it. Would have been very tempted at one point to actually spray some of it out. But the consensus was to persist and to keep on going as long as we can. Good advice, very glad that I took it. This picture here shows a field which was, if you study it closely, you can see some herbs, but you can also see a lot of weeds. So what we did was we grazed it, trampled it, and then topped it. The field on the right is a 6 species, which again shows the weeds and things. So we grazed it off as best we could and topped it. Slide, please. So it was a success after that. Once the weed burden went down, the herbs sort of took over. So there's July on the left-hand side, which again, it looks an awful lot better now. The herbs got a grip. That's a lot of plantain and chicory there that you see in there. So mini plantain. The crop on the right-hand side is plantain chicory, with the different deeper rooting grasses in the middle of it. First comment is the cattle were always very content on the swards, and as time went on, they managed to thicken out and become more what they should be. Still a few weeds. Got to get used to them. There's very little we can do about it. Slide, please. Right. So one of the big questions at the time was, what would it be like in the springtime? So with advice from Dale, we decided then that when the soil temperatures are low, we know that there's going to be a problem with the herbs growing. So what we had to do here was to leave as much behind, in other words, close off early in the autumn time to have the early bite, which is very important to us here in February. The sward, the picture you're looking at there is the 18 species mix, which was shown in the very first slide, which has already been grazed. It was grazed in early February, and that's the regrowth coming on it now. So leaving or closing up early in the autumn time worked to have the early bite, and it is recovering there with the good weather we're having at the minute. We had committed to no fertilizer, as I said. All the problems was the worming paddock then, as I said, no saffron grew, and so we're just left with the other bits and pieces that are in the mix, and the jury will be out on what we're actually going to do with that. Some of the saffron which is in the other mixes did grow, and another very interesting one was that pigeons love chicory. So in particular, our field of our monoculture of chicory, which was overwintering, was completely and totally demolished by the pigeons. And once they got all eaten, they started to go into the other fields and pick the chicory out of the other fields. Plantain has overwintered the best of all the crops. That was the plantain, red clover and white clover did really well over the winter time, but there has been no frost down here. We did notice last year that if there was a bit of frost, there's a bit of tipping at the top of the plant, and a few millimeters at the top of the plant broke off. Slide, please. Or that's it, is it? There you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That's brilliant. A great start for us. So we're heading up to County Antrim next, to Roger, farmers in partnership with his wife Hilary. Go ahead, Roger. Oh,
Hi, how are you? So I'm Roger Bell and my wife Hilary. So we're farming 78 hectares farm, mostly sheep, and we're running 50 cattle. So we're running about 550 ewes and we're grazing about 50 cattle. We are all perennial ryegrass. So we are probably 700 feet up. So we are sort of at the level where grass is stopping growing and you're into hill ground. So most of our fields have been reclaimed, and so we're on the upper end of we're probably the absolute opposite from where Paul is. So I wanted to try and grow Herbal just for performance and to see if everything was true, what was all said about. And my experience with it has all been very good. It has been a real good result. Yes, the lambs stay cleaner on it. Daily live weight gain is really good, and definitely can grow the same amount of grass or herbs with less fertilizer. So this is meaning more relevant now when fertilizer prices is going up and up. Probably next slide, Gillian. The one disadvantage I would probably have with it was just probably establishment. So this is the field here that with a picture of our lambs growing. The field was sowed last year, so it was a 7-acre field, established it in 21. So this, I would be wet and heavy, so this field would be one of the wetter, heavier fields on the farm. So I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to try it on the wetter land, and to see if I can get it to grow here, we can get it to grow anywhere, because there is quite a lot of chat about it. Is definitely suited for drier land, but no, you definitely can grow it on wetter land as well. The only problem I've seen with it now, I've had a couple of fields of it now, is establishment. I have to go down the steel seed bed, because if I tried it without the steel seed bed, all I seem to grow is weeds. Right. The method so I done with my steel seed bed is, so I plowed it off, power hard it, and we dissed it, we left it stones for probably 2 weeks, and made it ready, land leveled it, sowed our lime on it, sowed our fertilizer on it, and then at that stage we rolled it. We done everything bar put in the seed mixture. So we walked away at that stage. Now usually probably 10 to 14 days the weeds will germinate, but this year it turned dry, so we had to wait for the rain to come, and then eventually the rain did come. So that's my only issue with going down the steel seed bed. You have to wait for your wee weather windows for longer. So I had to wait for a suitable day to get it sprayed off at the start, and then you have to wait for a dry enough period to get it made ready, and then you have to wait till the weeds germinate. So this picture here is what my field grew with nothing in it at all. So that there's just basically chickweed, dockings, and any other weeds. So that's the weeds that it grew at that stage. And then I went in then and sprayed that off with half rate Roundup, and then waited another 5 days and sowed my mixture over the top of them weeds, which were all died off by that stage. So that is a really, really good steel seed bed. You have no hassle then with weeds in your crop, and the crop established really, really well. Next slide. So it really grew on, it really grew well. We had slight issue with it turned really wet, and some of it got washed out, and we had to patch bits of it in. But the next picture shows the lambs grazing on it. So we got 3 grazings off it. So this is the same field that you're looking at here now. We get 3 grazings off it, and daily live weight gains was good. Your lambs definitely stay cleaner on it than ordinary grass. There's a pile of plantain and chicory in it. Clover maybe not coming just so well. I'm hoping it'll establish more and come better this year, but the main benefits I see as just good performance and able to grow the same amount with less fertilizer. And I think that's me.
Thank you very much, Roger. That's brilliant. And now we head to another well-known sheep farmer, Crosby Cleland in Saintfield, County Down. So go ahead there, Crosby.
Thank you, Jason. Next slide, Gillian, please. Thank you. Closed flock, really working over the 74 hectares and 850 ewes roughly each year is what we're working with. Commercial lambs coming from half of the flock, the other half we tend to keep in the Cleland Highlander for replacements, and that helps us keep a good closed flock. No matter what the scan is each year, we still end up with 1.5 to 1.6 lambs per ewe. And the aim of what we are trying to do is improve the grassland management. We want to get more output of lamb, less days to slaughter. So we're looking to use the multi-species sward to improve the daily live weight gain of the flock, keep the growth in the sward during the drought summer periods. Next slide, please, Gillian. Thank you. The Eip project now, everybody else involved in the scheme have been sowing early year. I would sow, we only do the reseeds late in the year, as in August, set up for that time. I would be taking one cut of silage early in the year, need all the grazing we can get. And the big impact on our farm this last few years in particular, when we look at the growth of the grass over the last 4 years, 18-19, we were producing over 12 tons of dry matter per hectare. The last 2 years, we've actually just been above 7. The reason for that being that there's a drought period come in, we had 11 weeks in 2020, and we had 4 weeks and a week of rain, and then another 5 weeks after with no rain. So our growth disappeared at the height of the growing season. So that's why there's such an impact. So for that reason, I'm very interested in the plantain and the chicory in particular to get that growth during the dry period. This year we're put in 19 acres as in August past. We wouldn't have anything through the ground yet this particular year, but now the silage fields we did stitch in after the silage was cut in early June, the first week of June. The conditions that we have now with heavy clay here, the pHs, everything are fine. The rainfall is what you see. In fact, it's the same what Rogers is, but we're a lot more than what Dale or Paul have, but yet we still had the drought period in the middle. Big effect on what happens on our farm. So for that reason, we've looked at the species that we're putting into it. We want palatability for the sheep, heading time, very important. But what I have cut back on, it would be the Perennial Ryegrass. Our heavy ground suits Timothy, and it gives us that early bite and the late bite. The tall fescue is something I prefer to the ryegrass. It's not as strong a stem with sheep only. We don't want that high stalk coming from the ryegrass. So ryegrass in there, but certainly we've built up on the fescue in it. The cocksfoot I haven't tried yet, but because of the deep root and the 2 years of drought over the summer, I will possibly be trying it in future mixes. Obviously, the chicory has been a great benefit, clearing up on the drenching side, and it certainly has helped. We're well cut back on the drenching. Plantain is going to be no problem. It's growing well. White clover, great asset to the whole setup, and more of a mix of clover within even the sward that you might see in a photograph in a minute or two. It's been great benefit to us. Now, the red clover I have added to the silage sward, thinking of finishing the lambs on it later in the year, and we've still to find out progress from that. The 2 photographs below obviously showing the red clover and the silage sward, and the one on the right, that is the plantain and chicory coming through. It is growing. That was after about 6 weeks of no rain, and you can see that the plantain and the chicory are well ahead of the grass, and that gave us something to bite on during that period to keep the flow going. Next slide, please, Gillian. So our reseed is simple. We're doing the spraying off in July, no tillage, as in the sense of ploughing, but we use the Einbach. The sheep have well grazed down, and the direct drill, obviously the Einbach crisscross runs, and then we roll it twice afterwards, as well as allowing the sheep to get another week, a big flock of dry ewes, maybe in the August time, just to help trump it in. Hopefully the rain is coming down on it. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, I haven't got a photograph to show you, obviously, for this year, because that only came in August, but that is the field in the right that we're working under sward, half the field with the plantain and chicory, white clover and the ryegrasses and the other mixes. And on the left is just the clover and the ryegrasses. You can see the extra growth that is coming from the plantain and chicory during that dry period. Now, the direct drill, the big benefits that I get from it are there are less weeds appear. We don't bring up we'll have spot sprayed most of our fields, and they are fairly well clear of the docks and the other weeds. There's far less work. I've no stones to lick. It costs less for me to do. And with the sheep, it's working very well. And it's what I will intend to keep going, especially with our climate that seems to be coming through very haphazard. Now, what I'm looking for, animal performance looks good with the more paddocks. You know, the MS is helping, and we're going to find, I think, in the future, with no rain, be very, very beneficial to us. But in this year, we're actually looking at comparing the lambs. We have enough sward now to try this, and we're going to keep a flock of sheep with their lambs on the multi-species sward and compare it to a flock that stays on the ordinary ryegrass. Next slide, I think that's me. Is there another slide, Gillian?
Yeah, no, that's you, Crosby. Thank you very, very much, Crosby. Just a reminder to everyone, the questions are open at any time and they're coming in. Also, if you particularly want to see any of the questions that have already been asked, answered, you can click on the thumbs up icon and that kind of set up the scale. So now heading across to the other side of Strangford Loch, and Sam and Lauren Chesney. Sam sends his apologies tonight, but he is more than ably being deputized by his daughter, Lauren. So Lauren, I will hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So we are an 80-hectare farm in the east of County Down in the Irish Peninsula, as far east as you can get before you hit Scotland in Northern Ireland. We are primarily suckler cows, about 100 suckler cows. We finish all our cattle through to beef, and we generally take 30 to 40 blade calves a year as well. We also have a small lowland flock of about 80 sheep, and we are a fairly intensive grassland system, though we are slightly destocking at the moment. So why are we starting to go down this multi-species route? Our main factor was drought tolerance, because in the last 5 years, we've had 4 years of where we've had periods of where we've been in drought or have been in severe need of rain. So that was our main sort of thought behind them. We're also looking to maximize the yield of our grassland. So we are, while reducing our nitrogen, which is quite topical in a year like this as well. We're also looking to improve our soil structure and fertility, and also to sequester more carbon as well. So next slide, please, Gillian. So sort of what the mix we looked at was a perennial ryegrass and a timothy, chicory, plantain, red and white clover. We generally across the whole farm, we'd always be a very big fan of white clover, so it was something we'd always consider. And red clover, we have pure red clover swards at home as well for silage making, so we're very keen on them. Timothy is a sort of grass that we would always have put in, even into just every sward, mainly because we could get a very cold wind that would come off across Scotland. It's sort of that May time that would cut the grass growth in half, and we seem to find that timothy was one of the few things that would keep growing in that period. So for this multi-species project, we established another field in May 2021. It's about 5 acres. This is sort of our second field. We've already had 8 acres put in 2019, and we were very pleased with it, so we were quite happy to put more in. So this field was sort of a clay soil, quite heavy classification, one of the heavier fields in the farm. So it was, and how we established it was sort of a plough, power harrow, row, just sort of prepare the seed bed. At that point we sprayed it, and then we had to wait probably about 3 weeks to a month to be able to actually get any seed in, because at this point we sort of hit a drought and there was no rain coming, and we managed to get it in eventually, sort of June time, and we got it in and had 12 mils of rain the next day, and that was the only rain we had for about 4 weeks, 3-4 weeks after that, and it still managed to grow. How we went in was actually we went in with a wagtail, sort of just not to disturb any of the weed seeds. So we sort of mixed our fertilizer and our seed, multi-species seed, and our red start into all together, and then we sort of went in with our wagtail to spread it. We used sort of the red start as a nurse crop. Next slide, please, Gillian. So this here is just sort of a photo of what you can see, what it sort of looked like. Through that mid-July, that was sort of the first grazing there on the left-hand side. You can sort of see the red start. They're sort of overtaken. We sort of used it as a nurse crop to hold in the moisture to allow the multi-species to get started. And that's sort of it 2 days later after being grazed by the cattle. So it's very clean. So it is there, as you can see, with just wee bits of multi-species left, not multi-species, red start left is what those sort of patchy bits are. Next slide, please. So this is here what it was 12 days later, in very dry conditions at this point in July of last year, and you can sort of see that all the chicory, I think that was chicory, coming back very well at this point. And then you can sort of see a grass field next to it that was sort of grazed the previous 12 days. While it looks pretty green, there's not a lot of grass actually there for anything to graze. Next slide. So a bit about our experience so far. We've grazed both cattle and sheep so far on it, and the sheep tend to get the first grazing of the year so far, and the cattle get the majority of the rest of the season, so they do. Our focus on this project sort of will be suckler cows and calves, and sort of a mixed grazing rotation, so coming on and off the multi-species onto clover grass lays, see how they perform. So it did perform really well last summer, and even though we didn't graze it to July, it still grew 10 tons from July to October. So it did perform very well for us. We also had a really noticeable increase in biodiversity. There was some videos of us going around. You could see sort of that early morning period when you drive through it, all the swallows would come down to get all the bugs flying off it. And when the red clover would flower, you would see loads of bees and flies and things like that, and butterflies. We're also putting more in. We're putting 10 more acres in this spring in a field next door to it, sort of to give us a bit more, so we could possibly try to keep a batch of maybe cows or calves on it full time to see if we could get that done. We also noticed the cattle do have a preference. They do really like the herbs, so they do, and we'd find that when we take the cattle off it, that they would also eat other broadleaf plants, so such as docks. We'd find they would see a dock and they'd eat it to try it, thinking it might be a nice tasty bit of chicory or plantain, and they generally look quite disappointed when they figure out it's not. Our only thing about it is this is quite a heavy field and it does get trampled quite easily. We found if we had like a very heavy downpour of rain, that bit of the field would get trampled quite easily. So we do need to take that into account when we're grazing it. I think that's it for me.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Lauren. That's great. And finally, last but definitely not least, we go to Dale Orr, who's been a real pioneer in this whole area of multi-species swords, and Dale Farm near Strangford in County Down. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. Hello, everyone. I'm Dale Orr, and I farm organically about 500 acres down near Strangford, and I've been farming organically now since 1998. We keep traditionally bred cattle, Aberdeen Angus and Hereford cattle, and we keep purebred Clyn sheep as well. The cattle and the sheep are outwintered either on grass or on forage brassicas and turnips. And we aim to grow about 10 tons of dry matter per hectare every year without any chemical fertilizer at all. So we use these different grass mixes to try to achieve this. On the farm, we've got perennial ryegrass and white clover swards, with perennial ryegrass, red clover swards for making silage. And over the last 4 years, we've been developing these multi-species sward mixes to try to sort of broaden the range of the grasses that we have on the farm, and we've achieved real benefits from them. Can I have the next slide, please? So for this project, we've really been trialing a drought-resistant mix. Like everybody else in this area, we've suffered from really dry weather in 3 of the last 4 years. And over the whole farm, the grass yields would be down by maybe 2 tons of dry matter per hectare. So we thought we'd try this project to establish a drought-resistant mix. So after a lot of studying, we reckon Coxfoot, Medifesky, and Timothy with the red clover, white clover, plantain, and chicory would help us to provide forage for our animals over the dry spell. We particularly like the Barula Coxfoot because it's a lot more palatable than the older Coxfoots that we had previously used on the farm. So we believe this is like a real, or could provide real benefit for us in the future. The mixture was established. We used reds in mid-April. The reason we left it to mid-April is the herbs, they need a soil temperature of at least 10 degrees before they can get going. And we want once the plants, the seeds have been sown, that they grow really quickly, because obviously there's a real weed burden. We're obviously not allowed to use any sprays. So we wait till mid-April, and then when all the seeds are planted, then they grow really quick, and then they can compete with the weeds. We used Red Start as a nurse crop just to really protect the plants and hold that moisture in the early morning, you know, so the plants can get really going. On our farm, the soils would be clay soils. Our pHs range between 6.4 and 7.1. And our method of establishment was plough, pour hard twice, sow, roll. We pour hard twice, and then we actually rolled the hard ground just to create that really firm seed bed. Then the seed was sown, and then we rolled again. So the next slide, please. So sward management, we work rotational grazing, and it really suits these plants as well. We find that it works really well. Our paddocks are between 4 and 5 acres in size, and we really sort of use these pastures mostly for the sheep. And we find that it's a different rotational grass system than what you use on perennial ryegrass, white clover swards, because of the nature of the herbs. You can actually you put the sheep into the pastures when the plants are quite high. Like generally the clovers would be as high, the herbs would be as high as 20 centimeters. So they're basically going into 20 centimeters high forage, and they're coming out when the forage is about 7 centimeters high. So we're not grazing it right down to the floor like we normally would with the perennial ryegrass swards. We're leaving it a little bit taller, and this seems, we've sort of learned over the course of the years that this has really helped the persistence of the herbs. The herbs really don't like to be grazed really tightly. So if you leave a little of the herbs behind, it seems to help the persistence of the herbs. So for the nature of this project, as I say, the sward was sown in mid-April, and we were grazing it within 7 weeks. So after 7 weeks, we were grazing it, and then we went into basically our rotation. So it was grazed for, each paddock was grazed for between 5 and 6 days every 30 days. So as I say, there's a longer wait between grazings, but the sheep did particularly well on it, and because you left a little bit of it behind, also there's some more moisture within the soil. There's more moisture maintained within the soil. That meant even during the dry periods, the crop still kept growing. So that was really good. Our very last grazing was in early December, and that was just with the last of the store lambs. And we will now be, there's actually, the first grazing of it was today. We were putting ewes and lambs out today. So our first grazing was actually today. And we're hoping this should yield 10 tons of dry matter with, as say, no nitrogen inputs. Okay, next slide. So as I say, our experience so far, we don't use any nitrogen fertilizers, and over the whole farm, we target to get 10 tons of dry matter over the whole farm. The measurements so far in our 6 species multi-species sward is that it's done in the second year, did 11 tons of dry matter, even in dry conditions. And we've a plantain, chicory, red clover, white clover sward. And in fact, last year it did 12 tons of dry matter. So it can grow an awful lot of forage, these crops, even in dry conditions. And we find that our lambs, when in the last couple of weeks before they came off the yoke, they were doing 350 grams per day, which is incredibly good. And on average, the lambs over the whole flock, the lambs only got one worming. Some lambs weren't wormed at all, and some obviously got two. But it was basically one worming for every lamb on the farm, which is a big improvement. And it means also that we're less worried about anthelmintic resistance in the worm population on our farm because we're using less wormers. So basically that's it. It has to be managed slightly different than the other swards on your farm, but you'll definitely, with sheep, you'll definitely see huge benefits in terms of less worms required, and you can grow an awful lot of forage with it. So really, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dale. And that brings us to the end of our formal presentations. And now we're going just to our panel discussion. So I'll just ask all our speakers to turn on their cameras and also introduce, we're also joined tonight by Francis Lively, who has joined our panel here tonight for the Q&A session, and Denise Lowe as well from AFB, who've been both helping us with this project. So I'm just going to go ahead. So as you can see, we're going to answer the questions with the most votes first. So starting one for you, David, from Heather McCallman. Why do you add nitrogen fertilizer to the legumes in the plot study at Loughgall?
Am I on? Yes. No, it was simply from an experimental point of view to make sure everything is treated like for like, and to get a consistency across the trial. And I suppose second of all to that, even a grass clover sward, despite having just heard about Dale's zero additional nitrogen approach, the traditional route for even a grass clover sward would be some artificial nitrogen in the springtime to bridge that spring gap that some people would experience. So first answer, just to be equal and fair across the treatments.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to highlight why, because there's so many questions. I know David answered some of the technical ones with a typed answer, and you can see them in the answer tab of the Q&A box. Then the next one, I think obviously we've been talking a lot about County Down, but John Egerton asks a very good question here. There are completely different challenges for multi-species swords in the West and Northern Ireland, wet conditions that suit perennial ryegrass. What species are going to do well in these conditions, David?
Yeah, I think we really need to get some of this type of trial work and this on farms work out west. First of all, to answer the question properly, I think we can look at other species in the mixtures. We're still going to have legumes there as the source of nitrogen. We could look at subtly different grasses. And John's a big fan of perennial ryegrass and manages grass superbly well. But Timothy was mentioned earlier there, for instance, it has a slightly better tolerance of soil wetness. It also has a slightly earlier kickstart to growth in the springtime. So there's one other alternative grass species which we could look at in wetter, heavier soil conditions.
Okay, thank you. Then Michael McPolan, maybe another one for you, David, ask, can this be put into an existing sward, and what's the best time to do that and how? And maybe actually I'll ask David first, but anyone else who maybe wants to give an answer after that from the farmers?
Sorry, what was the first bit?
Can this, I think it means multi-species sward, be put into an existing sward, and if so, what's the best time?
For overseeding or stitching in, you might call it, or slot seeding into an existing sward. I think the one thing, and hopefully the other farmers will back me up, you must reduce the competition from the existing sward. If you're not spraying off and you've got a good, let's say a good ryegrass content there to begin with, you must reduce that competition before the seed hits the ground, and especially in that, well, I don't know, 4 to 6, maybe even as far as 10 weeks afterwards, depending on the growth, you must get in quickly and reduce the competition again of the existing sward. Otherwise, those small seeds and small plants will never get properly established.
Okay, thank you. A question here, maybe Francis, for yourself. Is there a potential for some of the MSS causing copper toxicity in continental sheep breeds? I suppose we saw earlier that MSS did have slightly higher copper.
I don't think the levels are going to be a concern of that there. To be honest, Jason, we recently have another ongoing study where we've actually undertaken a survey of grass throughout Northern Ireland and indeed parts of the UK as well. And actually the guideline figures for copper is actually quite low. So I don't see an issue here, unless there's some other specific underlying issue in terms of the soil or maybe pig slurry or something like that there, but I don't forecast any issue in that.
Dale, you've probably got more experience than most of us. Have you any heard of any issues on this, on copper toxicity?
No, I've never heard of copper toxicity with multi-species. No.
No, but I think maybe, Jason, if I could come in
Yes,
there,
please,
that
Denise.
I agree with Francis that I'm not aware of any issues, but I do think it is a research gap that with the mineral status that there isn't enough research on the resultant health of animals from that. So that is a gap that we did identify that we need more research on.
Okay, we've got some people want to know how dairy heifers do on these swards. Now, it's a beef and sheep webinar, but has anyone got any experience on dairy heifers? If not, I'm sorry, we'll have to pass on that one. Sorry, so apologies. We don't have.
Sorry, Jason, if I come in there, there has been work done elsewhere on dairy heifers, and that similar results to young stock. So I wouldn't forecast it being any different. Similar levels of performance.
Yep, I imagine that's the case. Question for Sarah from Orley Aubrey. Do you have any data on grass utilization percentage for multi-species and perennial ryegrass swards, also on ME? And we don't have ME as yet orally. We do hope to do a back calculation on it, but any questions on grass utilization, Sarah?
No, we haven't calculated it.
I mean, in terms, just maybe for some of the farmers present, I mean, do you notice much difference in terms of, obviously with multi-species, you generally try and leave a higher residual, but have you noticed any major differences in utilization between your multi-species and your perennial ryegrass swards?
Maybe I could say something here, Jason. We find that as the season progresses, that the sheep won't eat the perennial ryegrass, so obviously utilization is very poor. They preferentially graze the herbs first, and then they'd eat the clover. And our experience was that say after sort of mid-June to late June, they'll leave the ryegrass behind. So really, in terms of utilization, our sheep won't eat it. So the utilization is very poor from late summer onwards.
Okay. Maybe a question for Denise or David from the review end of things. Any data on how multi-species would perform on wetter blue clay type soils?
It'll be the ultimate challenge, I think, but it's probably some of the same answer as before. We would have to just look closely at which, particularly maybe the grass species again. You would want species that have got a tolerance, first of all, of maybe the pH in those soils, as well as the level of wetness.
Okay, thank you. An organic supporter of multi-species swards is from Seamus O'Kane. An organic supporter of multi-species swards advised me to eat a third, leave a third, and waste a third, as this means to maintain her presence and avoid use of fertilizer. Have you any thoughts on this technique? Because what we're really talking about is mob grazing I know, Francis, you've done some desktop work on mob grazing. Do you want to make any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that would be a common practice with some people that are involved with mob grazing, but obviously it wouldn't be that typical in Northern Ireland at this stage. So I have no real comment on that, but certainly from our own experience, certainly you would not graze multi-species and herbs the same way as you'd graze say perennial ryegrass sward. But Denise may have more information from the literature review.
No,
I
just
mean,
really what you're saying.
Dale, you're an organic farmer yourself. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've come across that as well before. With dairy farmers, especially in the Cotswolds, they would seem to have that philosophy, and that they would let the multi-species forage grow really high. They would be working on a 50-day rotation, and the animals would eat it for half a day within the 50 days. So they're going in, and it would be waist high nearly. So and they believe that if they trample that third, then they're building up the carbon within the soil, and basically they're trying to improve the carbon quality of their soil.
Okay, thank you very much. Alistair Armstrong, maybe we've had this before, but how would MSS do in the Western Northern Ireland where we have higher rainfall and more of a clay loam? I know you've done some of that before with John's answer. David, is there anything more you want to add to that?
No, I suppose the high rainfall element there is a concern, and the same if you had a high rainfall period, like a very wet back end or something right across the province. These swards with the herbs have a slightly elevated growing point at the soil surface and can be susceptible to tramping. So wet conditions, high rainfall, staying on the sward too long in a rotation, maybe the tramping would do proportionately, I think, more damage to the herbs than necessarily to the grasses or the clovers.
Okay, thanks. I also see a question as to how we're forming like Donegal, and it's probably the same thing. We don't have data. I mean, it'd be great to get some more data. I mean, we do have a farm in Kirkstown. Unfortunately, couldn't be here tonight. Although to be fair, it's a fairly dry part of the world there as well. I see was asked a question about Donegal. I am aware there is another EIP group in a Showen area. Denise, can you remember, did you look at some of that work when you were doing your stuff, looking at some multi-species?
No, I'm not aware of any shown, but I mean, there would be parallels with an EIP group in Wales, which was an upland group. I think maybe that might be what you're thinking, but I mean, the multi-species swords were successful in an upland environment too, which I guess people have questions on that. But again, the main conclusions for that was that it was just a change of mindset on the management of them.
Okay, thank you. David, a question for you. If you're sowing in an already established sward, how do you reduce the competition without spraying? So what's the kind of techniques you might try and use to stitch in?
Well, first of all, it could be after a cut of silage or grazing where you physically removed the sward canopy and literally skinned the sward off. As well as that, you could go through, and Dale and others in the group have had experience of this, opening up the not only the sward but the soil surface, crumbling it slightly by trailing either discs or harrows of some sort. Any tool in the box you can use to try and physically open the sward surface and create like a mini tilth of soil there, and then think about stitching into that. So that's how to reduce the competition. And afterwards, after the new population of plants has started to peep through and the grass is starting to grow back again very vigorously, as it will do, you'd have to come in with either a cut or a graze again, preferably a grazing with a lot of mouths for a short spell of time, a fast graze.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a question here then for maybe actually I know because Dale Paul and Lauren, you've all used a nurse crop. So it's a question here, what is a nurse crop and how does it work? So Dale, you've had the most experience with this. Do you want to kind of discuss the nurse crops you've used?
Well, I generally use Red Start, which is a very fast growing brassica. And basically I grew that because it grows really fast, and then it produces like a canopy really to trap the moisture in the spring, you know, and protects the plants below. So basically that's why, and it seems to work particularly well. And then I get the benefit of the Red Start all summer. You know, after it's grazed once, it just keeps growing. But basically it's just to protect the slower growing plants below by sort of capturing the dew in the morning, you know, and providing a canopy to give them somewhere to grow.
Paul, I know you maybe tried some with nurse plants and some without. Any thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add the deal there and say that when you get that first canopy of Red Start coming up, it suppresses some of the other weeds that you might have. We're back to weed control is a bit of an issue. And the ones where we put in the nurse crops, you would have had a less pressure on the weeds. We're also, because it grew so quickly, we were able to come in, graze it quicker and graze the weeds and all at the same time. And then it gave a chance for what we really wanted to come then at following that grazing. It's definitely a good idea. And it's one to do, and as far as we're concerned, it'll be done now every time.
Lauren, I know you've had some. You tried Red Start as well as a nurse crop?
We tried Red Start last year. We actually took it on Dale's advice. So we tried it and it worked really well. The Red Start came up really quick, a lot quicker than everything else. So obviously we had to go in and get it quicker, to eat it out quicker. And we'd very clean crop, very little weeds in it. We'd also, in the previous one, we'd put in wheat to take it off as a whole crop. So we had. We found it wasn't as we didn't like that as much. We found that it almost seemed to suppress some of the herbs where it got heavier in some of the field. We found that the wheat seemed to suppress it, so we probably wouldn't do that again. We'll probably definitely go back for the Red Start though.
Okay, here's the one. The $64,000 question is from Martin McCaffrey. How are weeds such as stock nettles, etc., little controlled? Dale, obviously as an organic farmer, you can't use sprays anyway, but and you've been at this for a long time. So what's your thoughts on weed control?
Well, I find that as the crop gets going in years 2 and 3, the weed burden declines over time. So in the first year, I would have had issues with docks and thistles, but the sheep seem to eat all the docks out, so that's no problem. The thistles would persist for 2 years, but in the 3rd year they seem to go, and nettles aren't really a problem with me. I have some nettles in some of the fields, but it's not really a big problem. Basically, as the crop gets going, the weeds get going, you know, sort of thing, really. As time progresses, the weeds seem to be smothered out or disappear from the crop itself. But they are an initial problem and a real sickener at the start. I think, my goodness, that's a field of weeds rather than a field of anything. But I would just say to people, persist and you'll find that they'll be pleased with it after a period of time.
Paul, I know you had a great trouble with weeds when you first sowed, but then you really got on top of it. So any comments from yourself?
Yeah, I think an important one is that, well, they're going to be there, and you have to persist. Dale's quite correct there. What we might have done that whenever we did try the steel seed bed, we had the same problems as the Hillary and whenever the weeds, you have to wait for the weeds to come and then you have to spray them off. But what we did, and then when we went to sow, we sowed with the ironbark, and when we tickled across the top of the ground, we actually stimulated a second flush of weeds. So going back to what Crosby said, he used, or I think Roger and Hillary said that they used a waggly tail, or Lauren, you used a waggly tail, and it didn't disturb the top of the ground. And we went to see yours that time, and it was completely different. So the tip there would be, if you have an established or waiting to establish the crop, and you're doing the steel seed bed thing, is don't disturb the seed bed again to get that second flush of weeds.
Thank you. Francis, did you want to make a comment there? on that one? No, that's okay. No problem. David,
maybe just one
okay.
comment, Jason. Actually, you know, and this would certainly come from some of the work, some of the review with mob grazing. You know, in this system, you do have to sort of tolerate weeds to some extent, and you know what it is. You know, this is often a different type of farming to what we're used to. So there's a little bit of that toleration required as well.
Okay. David, maybe just a question for you to clarify, what is a stale seed bed?
Okay, it's basically, it was terrifically well described by Roger earlier. He did all of the preparation, all the cultivation, the original spraying off, etc., etc., etc. And at the point where you would normally go in and sow the seed, you stop. And the point of that is to allow another couple or a few weeks thereafter for weed seeds to germinate. And I'll tell you, it's not just broadleaf weeds that will germinate. It's amazing the grass population that will grow in a stale seed bed as well, because there's a huge weed bank of seeds sitting at the surface, ready to be triggered, is the word that Paul used earlier there. Once they're physically brought to the surface, or the light triggers them, or whatever, once the growing conditions kick in, they will germinate. So you have to, stale means you're kind of, if you think about the title, stale seedbed, you're trying to exhaust that surface population of weed seeds before you put your very expensive, highly sought after seed mixture anywhere near it.
I think it's also very important then to say that that seed mixture doesn't like to be buried too deep. So
yeah,
especially the herbs now, they just need tickled in. That when I go over, I'm just tickling them in as light as you possibly can. Yeah, establishment then is really, really good.
Yeah,
the seed is a very, very small seed.
Good point.
I think you're muted, Jason.
Sorry, I pressed the mute. Sorry, apologies. Sorry, David, is there any experience of multi-species with silage systems?
Yes, but not a lot. We have made multi-species sward silage here in 2021 and currently being fed to housed sheep pre-lambing. I think that the proviso is there, and it's back to one of Sarah's points earlier. If you noticed the qualitative differences between multi-species herbage and if you like, a grass-only type sward, it's 1 to 2% lower dry matter. Okay, so it will need a proper fast wilt to try and recover that extra amount of moisture that you're dealing with. If you were to bale that or ensile that, it could make for a sort of a poor quality silage. So wilting would be essential, and perhaps an additive just to be sure.
Could I add to that?
Yeah,
Jason?
please do.
We had visitors from England. They're a few years ahead of this, and they're sponsored through their governments to put these things in. One type they use has to, by their regulation, has to grow right out till it's fully mature, and they do that, and then they ensile it. And they said, look, there's nothing to fear about doing that on that type because it's relatively mature. Back to the extra bit of, well, pick your weather. It's not as dependent on the stage that you do, so pick your weather, get it right, bale it or ensile it. Going back to the 6 species, which looks more like a conventional field of grass with a few herbs in it, exactly as David said there, it just needs a bit of extra. It needs a rapid, fast wilt before you do it. But the point they made to me at the time was, don't be afraid of it. It can be done.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Jason,
go ahead, Crosby.
Jason, we made baled silage out of a paddock that got well ahead of us, but I think the point is we get into it before it got quite rank, before the stems got hard, And to me, it made very good silage and went very well with the sheep.
Thank you. I know, funny, when we went on our study tour down south, I mean, the message was, as long as you make it dry, don't be afraid of the silage. I mean, Lauren, maybe I could come to you because I know you haven't done so much many silage with multi-species, but I know you and your dad have done a lot of work with red clover with some really good results. Do you want me to just comment on that?
Yeah, red clover is a wee bit different. We would find you would really only allow the red clover to wilt for 12 hours, no more. Otherwise, the leaves would fall off and blow away, and you'd be left with the stems. So it could dry up very easily. We did make whole crop with the multi-species. We first cut off one of our other fields of it. We didn't leave it to wilt long enough. We only left it half a day, and we found it was very wet. But this was very young, leafy material. So it was. So it definitely does need a wilt. Red clover silage is a bit different. It doesn't need that length of time. But we would be very careful about driving over it because you could damage the crown very easily. And there's definitely bits of the field where it's been a wee bit wet, and you could definitely say that those parts of the field were a week or two behind the rest of the field where you've been driving over it. So it's wee things like that.
Okay. A question here: will lower sodium level result in reduced utilization? I'm not aware of that, but if anyone wants to comment, David or Francis. No, I'm not sure we've got much to add on that one. How did the composition, maybe a question for Sarah, how did the composition of the MSS, well, I suppose this is maybe, I suppose probably we'll talk mainly about EcoSword because the other study probably hasn't been going long enough to really kind of look at this, but how did the composition of the MSS vary between the farms during the year? And do you have information on quality at different times in the season? I suppose we do have a number of different quality results. We haven't maybe analyzed them that way yet, but Sarah, do you want to make any more comments on that?
It will definitely in the springtime, the percentage of herbs and clover would be lower. Sort of as the season progresses more towards the late summer, autumn, the percentage of herbs and clover in the sward definitely increased. The variation between farms, sort of in the late summer, autumn time, the best farms would have had about 15% plantain, 10% chicory, but herb persistency was already an issue in some of the farms, so they would only have had maybe 1% plantain and 1% chicory. So there was quite a variation between the farms and during the year.
Okay, Sarah, just while you're on, another question there is how are the yields growth measured? Is it plate meter recalibrated or is it cut and weigh? And I believe it's latter, isn't it, Sarah?
Yeah, all the results for the EcoSword was cut and weigh method.
Yeah. I mean, we are going to try and look at how you might calibrate, but it's going to be so difficult because there are so many, no multi-species swords same as another, depending on the volume of herbs and so on. Fergal Watson asks a question: can multi-species swords be established by desiccated grass, then graze or cut, then sow with a direct drill moor type machine? David, any comments on that? And I suppose the thing to bear in mind there with a moor type machine is the point that Roger made a moment ago about not burying the seed too deeply.
Yeah, it's all of the above again. It's about timing, it's about preparation of the ground, and I think less so the type of machine that you actually put it in with, as long as it doesn't get buried. These seeds are the pinhead size, okay? I mean, I think we talk about this a lot, but I think we actually do lose quite a bit of our seed out of the bag straight away by having too open a seed bed.
Okay. A quick one for you, Dale. It asks here, do you sow the MSS with the red start in the spring? So is the red start and the MSS sown together?
Yeah, it's all mixed up in a butter churn, just 1.5 kilos to the acre.
Yeah, David, one here. Is there greater flexibility in timing grazing to match the right stage for good animal performance, or how do you do that?
I suppose it's about sward height targets, maybe. Dale talked about height targets there, and on our own Brown Hill study. the timing of grazing was roughly, 10 to 15 centimeters entry and maybe 5 to 8 centimeters exit. Now that varies again through the summer. We had a drought period and we allowed the entry sward height to rise and consequently the exit sward height to rise as well. But to answer the question, greater flexibility and timing to match the right stage for good animal performance. It's getting that balance between having enough reserves left in the sward stubble to allow the roots to replenish for the next grazing, and balancing that with making sure that the stock are adequately fed with highly nutritious herbage. So it's probably back to those sward height targets.
Okay. Then there's just another kind of one comment here. Waste a third is the main objective, not building organic matter, especially on light soils or arable rotations. In Francis, again, you've done the work on mob grazing, and that generally that would be right, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's generally the system I've adopted. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. No problem. Lots of good discussion. You need less nitrogen for multi-species sward. What about other additions such as P and K? Dave, any particular comments on on what MSS need in terms of phosphate and phosphorus?
Yeah, it's probably another bit of a research gap. Here we go again. But generally speaking, a good starting point would be to use the guidances for grass clover, successful grass clover, and that you have to have the right pH, 6.2 and above, and you have to have the P and the K at the right indices. Otherwise, your legume will not survive and persist. And that, we keep emphasizing it, that's the main nitrogen supplier to the whole of the multi-species sward, to feed the grass and to feed the non-leguminous herbs. So yeah, the grass clover guidance would be a good place to start. We don't have absolutely refined sets of specific targets tailored to all of these different multi-species mixes, but I would start with the grass clover.
Okay, I think our point we do denote is that pH is absolutely critical, isn't it, for multi-species swords of all things to get right?
Yeah, and it's probably most important for the clover, believe it or not.
Okay, the only one final question is just asking about the recording of the webinar, and yes, it will be available on the AgriSearch website and YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the week there. And okay, cost benefit analysis, we'll look at that. And listen, I'm going to draw it to a conclusion. To see a couple more coming in there, but we're just gone past 9:30, and I don't want to kind of keep it going for too long. Let me try and get back to you on those couple of points directly. So I'm going to wrap up and say my profound thanks to David, Sarah, Paul, Roger, Dale, Crosby, Lauren, Francis, and Denise for their great contributions to this evening's webinar, and not just to this evening's webinar, to this project in general. It's very much a bottom-up, farmer-led project. This, and the farmers drive it, and really are a pleasure to work with. So I'd like to pay tribute to all of them for all the work and the enthusiasm they put into this project. My special thanks to Gillian Hoy for all the work she's put into organising today's event, and indeed the EIP project in general, which she leads on the management of. And again, I would like to acknowledge DERA and the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development who fund this project. And again, I see Nigel Murphy and Russell Forster who supervise that and carry on tonight. And again, acknowledgements to them for all the work they put into the project. There is a number of other webinars. We're coming towards the end of the season, but there's 2 more webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks. One later on this week by the Northern Ireland Sheep Programme on developing a sustainable system. Details of that can be found on both our website and the CAFRE websites. Next week, we have the final in our series of these European Innovation Partnership webinars, and that's from the Leather Jackets EIP group, looking at the challenge of that. So that's next Thursday evening. Full details on the AgriSearch website. Then I'm delighted to say we're going to get back to some farm walks, which we've had not too many of in recent years due to COVID. And the first farm walk AgriSearch is organising in conjunction with our partners in the ARC0 European Innovation Partnership Project, which is led by John Gilliland, will be on the farm of Hugh Harbison in Akidui on the 27th of April. Click on to either the ARC0 or the AgriSearch website, and you'll find the links there to book and more information there. I'll be adding more information as we get nearer the time. And we also are hoping to, we will be organising some farm walks on some of the farms you see here tonight for multi-species swords project, and we'll be announcing them in due course. Finally, thank you all very much for attending. It's been great. We've had well over 150 on tonight, which is excellent. Please, just a final plea to do fill in the feedback survey, which will come up at the close of the webinar to give us some much needed feedback and suggestions for how we might do things in the future. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to all for joining, and I wish you all a very good evening.